My name is Lora Painter, weeknight evening anchor at ABC 10 here in Sacramento, and a proud board member of your Sacramento Philharmonic Opera. Such a pleasure to see you here. Thanks so much for joining us and spending your Saturday with us. Our second to the last concert of the season is just breezing by so fast. But it's such an honor to see you, and you've brought the sunshine, I think, with us. So beautiful, beautiful Saturday. Joining me on stage now is our esteemed conductor, our special guest, Timothy Myers. A round of applause, please. Well, welcome to town. I understand it's not your first time, though, playing with the Phil, right?
That's right. I was here right about 2 years ago for a subscription program with the Phil, and we had a really great time, and I was very happy to be invited back and to come back and work with this fine group of musicians and for a very warm audience.
Well, thanks for coming back.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We appreciate it. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Why conducting? How did you get into it? Do you come from a musical family?
I grew up in the thriving metropolis of central Kansas. Yes, exactly. I mean, kind of the definition of underserved from a classical music standpoint. And I was telling Jen Reason when I did an interview with her this week, I was like, I love doing interviews on classical radio stations, public radio stations, because that was my exposure to classical music for the first dozen years of my life, until I heard an orchestra live for the first time. So I have a great affection and appreciation for that. But I have 3 siblings, and my parents wanted all of us to study piano plus another instrument, not for to become a vocation, but rather an avocation and for edification, because they knew what that could do for one's life. The discipline of learning an instrument and practicing and being coachable and being a continuous learner, and all of these things that we know this experience provides. And so I studied piano, and my second instrument was a whole bunch of other instruments, because I'm a very curious person, and so I would, one of my brothers played the trombone, and so I picked up the trombone and kind of went through the method books, and I thought, okay, I have a basic idea. I never played it in public or anything, and so I just sort of was a serial, some people are serial entrepreneurs. I was a serial dabbler.
What else did you dabble in? Okay, so trombone, but piano was your forte, right?
That's right. Piano is the only instrument that I've ever played at a professional level, that I studied all the way through graduate school. But I didn't even know that people made a living with music who weren't music teachers. Because I knew my piano teacher and I knew other piano teachers, at the school, and so it wasn't even on my radar that there were people who were professional performers, for example, until I was really in late junior high and high school, and I started learning more about it. And then I was studying piano, and I went to undergraduate. I was very curious, so I was studying piano and philosophy and literature and all of these things, and then I got interested in conducting, because I learned that, believe it or not, I didn't like spending several hours a day alone in a room with a largely inanimate object.
Very true. Pianos are very isolating. I play as well, and it's very alone, and you get very into your own little thoughts and critiques
And so for me, I found that my joy in music making was with other people. And so I started through the piano collaborating. And then that's what led to conducting. And that's a whole other story of how you start as a conductor, because, like the piano, it is sitting there waiting for you to practice it. Newsflash, orchestras are not. So
you have to wrangle up a good 50, 60 group of friends and play together.
So as you start out as a conductor, then I was really fortunate to have some excellent mentors who helped me understand what the craft of conducting is, and how to get started and how to turn one opportunity into another, which is the critical part of starting a career and sustaining a career.
And I know you're a very busy man. You've you said you came into town around Tuesday, started doing rehearsals. You have an early flight tomorrow back to Austin with more projects that you're working on. So how much time do you have to spend with a typical orchestra for a one-night show? Or how much time did you have to prepare for this? And I know that's part of the job, and everyone's such a professional and they can just jump right in. But tell us about the preparations for tonight.
So the project, it really depends on what I'm doing. The schedule here is fairly compressed. So I came on Tuesday, late Tuesday night. Wednesday I did an interview and then was really able to kind of rest up a little during the day. Then we had 2 rehearsals Thursday, 2 rehearsals yesterday. I have a 6 a.m. flight tomorrow to Austin, where it's not a full-time residence, but I am the music director there, and I have rehearsal tomorrow evening. But that's for an opera, and that process is much longer. So it's a few weeks of rehearsal, and then the performances. And so it really depends on what the scope of the project is. But I like having a balance, because sometimes it's nice to come in and just have a really focused rehearsal time, perform, and then move on to something else. And then other times it's nice to actually spend a few weeks digging into something, especially a big piece like Carmen.
And then for tonight, if you think of, this might be a weird analogy, you tell me, but if we think of a music program for an evening as kind of a meal, and the different pieces going together with the wine and the desserts and all these things pairing together in this really beautiful, tasteful, enjoyable way, talk about tonight's program, how these 3 pieces will give us a special experience. What do you think about that?
Well, I do like food and wine, so this is a great analogy for me. I think one of the beautiful things about what we do is being able to pair things together that on the surface might not make sense until you know a little bit more. So I'm glad you're here, but I'm sure it says also in your program notes that the first piece we're playing by Carlos Simon, Fate Now Conquers, was written in 2020, commissioned by the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Carlos is now the composer in residence at the Kennedy Center. And so he wrote this piece. It's about 5 minutes long, and his inspiration for the piece was a journal entry made by Beethoven in 1815, which was, of course, about a dozen years after he wrote the Second Symphony. But from around the time of the Second Symphony, Beethoven's deafness was accelerating with some rapidity. And around the time that he wrote the Second Symphony, he would spend a lot of time in an area outside of Vienna called the Heiligenstadt. And there he wrote something that's referred to as the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is a collection of letters, journal entries, and we see that he's in a very, very dark place. He feels as though he has his whole creative spirit left to give, but he's losing his hearing, and there are a lot of other things going around him, that he's in a very, very dark, spirited place, and he's pouring it out in these letters to his brothers, etc. And so, like most composers, we can learn a lot about them through these letters. But I thought it was really fascinating how Carlos took a journal entry of Beethoven's, and then, even more interesting, he takes the harmonic structure of the second movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony as the palette for this piece. So again, it's something that's very tied to Beethoven in a number of ways. Beethoven's Second Symphony is, we think about his Third Symphony, the Eroica Symphony, as one of the sort of groundbreaking works in the classical canon, which is true. But what I love about the second is you already see him trying to break out of that shell, right? So he includes a scherzo instead of a minuet. And it's long. It's much longer than his First Symphony, and this was. The critics in Vienna really, really loved to take people down. This is very harsh. And the critics about this piece said it just went on, and it was drivel, and finally like a dragon that finally gasped to its death in the last movement. Really awful things. But which makes me feel pretty good when I get a bad review, because I think, yes, I'm doing something right. But we see that Beethoven was already just pushing past any resistance that was there to create anew. And so it's fun to do the Second Symphony because we really see this sort of bridge in his life and his work and how he started to create. And then it's also just classic Beethoven. There are a lot of inside musical jokes. The finale especially, there are all of these moments where he just takes you on a turn that you're not expecting. You know, something really abrupt happens, and so it's just a joyful thing to play, and it's been really great to put it together with the musicians this week. So I would say, you know, Carlos Simon is the appetizer, and Beethoven second is the entree, that you're getting a great dessert with the Peer Gynt. And I love this music. I actually had the fortune in 2006 to conduct a full version of Peer Gynt. So Peer Gynt is the incidental music for Henrik Ibsen's play. I had the fortune to be able to conduct a production of it in Central Park in New York with the National Theatre Company from Norway. And so it was really, it's fun to come back to the music now and have that context for it, like the dramatic. So it's Solveig's song, you'll hear the completely instrumental version, but to know what the text is and know all of the, you know, context around it is really fun. And it's just wonderful music a lot of us have known for a long time, and it's just a treat to hear it in person.
Yeah, and as soon as I really started diving into the research for the pieces tonight, instantly 4 songs, 4 selections from Peer Gynt stick out. Morning, Anitra's Dance. In the Hall of the Mountain King, I want to ask you about that one too, and then you mentioned the Solveig song. And how do you keep the tempo? Because if anyone's been in band in middle school, you've done a rendition of In the Hall of the Mountain King, and it just accelerates so fast. And of course, you're a professional, so is our orchestra, but to get that with such precision, it could easily run away. I know that in my 7th grade band class, you know, the train kind of goes real fast. So how do you manage that piece?
It gains momentum quickly, and I find, well, we've talked about this in rehearsal, and we have a specific structure that we're using. So we're not, one of the challenges is if you start getting faster too early, then you have nowhere to go, and then you get in trouble. So we've really paced it out and been very disciplined about where it starts to move and how much it starts to move, so that we architect a real trajectory towards the very last note.
Yeah, let's talk more about this piece. It's so beautiful. I get a lot of imagery when I listen to this. I can imagine I'm in Norway, and when you mentioned that you had played it in Central Park, what a glorious location amongst the trees and the sky above. And tell me more about what you know about what he was trying to, what story he was trying to tell with that piece. I know it's part of the Ibsen play, but beyond that, to me, I could imagine ballerinas, and it could be with a dance production as well. What are some of your thoughts on that piece?
Sure. So the play is spoken, but then with this incidental music, there were songs inserted, and it's interesting because we don't ever think of Grieg as an opera composer, right? He didn't really write opera. He wrote some art songs, but we can learn from this music that he was inherently dramatically minded. And what's really astonishing, and what's been fun to mine with the orchestra this week, is the range of expression in this music, from just the softest of softs to the most powerful of powerful, has been really great to explore and really use the broadest color palette that we can and expressive palette that we can.
And tell us about the selections that you have chosen for this piece tonight, for Peer Gynt. There are multiple other pieces that are not typically performed. Is that how that goes?
There's one. So what Grieg did was, after he wrote this entire score, which is fairly lengthy, is that he created 2 suites. And so we are doing most of those 2 suites, although in different order. then he put them, and then we've inserted the opening, the prelude, from the full Peter Gynt score. So that's something that a lot of people will have not heard before, because it's not included in either of the suites, but we are doing it tonight at the beginning of those selections.
Very interesting. And then how do you prepare as a conductor? How do you get into a mindset for the different pieces that you're performing with an orchestra? And because we had mentioned before, you are very busy, you're working with a different crew, a different team, you know, maybe multiple times a month, a different team, a different country. How do you prepare for that and get ready?
I think for me, it's about being prepared enough that I am able to work with who is in front of me. Because, you know, like I told you, I didn't love being a pianist because of all the solitary time, but then I became a conductor, which is a lot of solitary time. But, you know, being prepared, but also open to ideas, right? So I think the general thing about conducting is that I'm coming with the score learned, and an idea about what I feel it should sound like, or what I would like for it to sound like, or how I think the composer wanted it to sound. And then I'm giving physical information to the orchestra, starting with the tempo, the speed, and then going from there. And then I'm hearing what's coming, and so in a millisecond, I'm analyzing, okay, is that what I'm looking for? No. If it's not, or yes, maybe that's great. But if it's not, why? Is it something I'm doing? Do I need to adjust my body language? Am I not giving something clearly enough? Or do I need to stop and ask for it a little bit differently? And so this is this cycle that's going on. And sometimes an orchestra will present, or a player, for example, in a solo, will do something in a way that is better than how I had thought of it.
Oh, what a beautiful thing when that happens, right?
It is. And so it's important to be listening and open to that you don't always have the best ideas. But you know, what you're trying to do, and then each orchestra plays with its own style. And so what you're doing in the rehearsal process is you're marrying these things, so that in the end you have something that is very bespoke for this audience tonight in Sacramento.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned some musical jokes that Beethoven had put in tonight's symphony. Can you tell us about that? I think for our modern audience, we're so used to visual jokes, physical jokes, and what we think of as funny in the year 2024. For his time, what would have been funny? How would that have manifested in the music? What should we be listening for? What does a musical joke mean, or at least in Beethoven's terms?
If we think about the context in which this music was presented, and remembering that it was popular music in 1803 when it was premiered, that the audience, of course, had certain expectations, and Beethoven thrived on obliterating those expectations. And he does in this piece as well. So there are just things where all of a sudden he will sort of do a little bit of a cliffhanger musically, where you're just not sure exactly what's going to happen, and then all of a sudden just interrupt with something. And you know, in these early symphonies of his that don't have, you know, they have two horns and two trumpets. There are no trombones. There's only timpani. But you have to understand in that time that when a timpani was used like this, it really got people's attention. And so there are a lot of things in there that I think will immediately come across to the audience, moments of suspense, and then he gives you something completely unexpected. Or chromatically, he might suspend something and lead you somewhere where you're not exactly sure where it's going, or might develop something or introduce something new. And so I think for me, it's just about listening and just getting on the ride, so to speak, and just letting it take you somewhere. And then, of course, in something like the second movement, which is just very, very beautiful, and you know, it's very, very expressive, to just enjoy it and fall into the middle of it and make your own story for it.
What was the story you think he was trying to tell? And he does take us through an emotional roller coaster. And it's still very Beethoven, still very rich and royal. But in your opinion and in your studies as well, what was he trying to tell the audience at that time?
I don't think he was thinking very much about the audience.
Is that him, part of him breaking the mold at that time, really just going for it?
I believe so, yeah. Is that we don't see him, yes, he was often working on commission, but he was not trying to please. Just as a person, he was not trying to please. He was a very opinionated man about everything, not just music, but politics. And he was one of those guys that you may or may not want him at a dinner party at your house, right? Because he might actually bring up something that, is not considered what you want to talk about at a polite dinner party. But I don't think he was thinking about the audience. I think he was in pursuit of something different and determined to find it and exploring. I think he was an intrepid explorer musically and dramatically. And so for me, I think he was just doing what he had to do. And he just could not do anything else.
Very interesting. Let's contrast with Grieg. What was his standpoint? Several decades after Beethoven, still the same century typically, but a completely different art form as well, Romantic period, right? So tell us about him. What was going on in Norway? What was going on in Europe? What would have inspired him? What was his motivation in his storytelling orally?
Right, well, if you advance just that many years, of course, the orchestras were typically much larger and employing many more things like with Beethoven, timpani only. Now, Grieg is using a lot of percussion, he's using a lot of low brass, and not that Beethoven couldn't do that eventually, but in the Romantic period, larger orchestras were very, very normal, right? And so if we're thinking about Brahms, for example, we envision these lush sounds that happen in Romantic orchestration. And the art of orchestration had actually advanced quite a lot by then, because this guy named Berlioz came along and started really pushing the envelope. And so I think in the case of Peer Gynt, that Grieg is reacting to text that he was given and trying to bring emotional layers that enhance the drama of the story and maybe even provide subtext, which I think is what good dramatic composers do. I think Don Giovanni is happening here very soon, right?
Next month.
So this is a perfect example of Mozart's genius in writing opera, is that there's text, and then the music that he's writing is also a character. So it's oftentimes commenting on what the characters are saying or doing. Many times it's saying something that they are not. Maybe it's making jest of something. And so I think this is very common for composers who were really great dramatic composers, and Grieg is one of those. And we get that huge range. And of course, being in the landscape where he was, it's extraordinarily striking. And of course, these environments do inspire things from composers.
Very understandable. And speaking of the emotional ride that we are on when we listen to live music and to these composers tonight as well, tell us about, well, first of all, you have a podcast as well, right? So and you've spoken with some really great guests and about the impact of listening. So considering what we've spoke about with the range of emotions that we feel, tell me more of what you've learned, through your work there, the power of music on the listener, on the audience. What do we gain from a night like this?
Oh, Laura, we gain the world.
Beautiful.
We gain the world. So I do have a podcast called Listening on Purpose. And I believe that listening is the access point that we need as humans for connection. And that this is something that is life or death, right? And that what we do is not casual entertainment, right? I look at what happens on this stage tonight as a miracle, because it's a group of musicians, it's an audience, me as an intermediary, a composer, a score, an interpretation that has evolved through decades and decades, and in some cases centuries, to create something that never happened before and will never happen again. We could play the opening of the Beethoven and stop and play it again, and it would be different. And so that's what I mean by a miracle. And the great thing about it is that it's happening to provide human connection and to level the playing field so that we can come into a room with people who are very different than we are, but have this experience of community in an increasingly digitized world where we are being told that these things are connecting us, but we know now, and we have a lot of science to back it up, that they are actually doing the opposite. So for me, I consider what we do as almost the antidote to modern entertainment, because we are providing this experience for people to connect. And this is physics and science. I mean, the way that things are going to move off the walls and then through your body and give you this emotional roller coaster if you open yourself to it. This is a really special thing that doesn't happen, and it requires risk, right? These are virtuosic players who put a lot on the line to do this, and you are here and you showed up with an open mind, hopefully. And so I think this experience where we are all in the room doing something really special together is critical to how we move forward as a culture.
That is so well said and so beautifully said, and really adds to the impact and the value of all of us collecting here within this space, wherever we come from, in Sacramento, north, south, east, west, maybe from different states and other cities. It is really a beautiful thing that music is connecting us together, and even Beethoven and Grieg, centuries later, we're still drawn to them. And if you want to speak to that, what keeps their music going? Maybe it is part of the physicality, as you mentioned, us listening to it live and having that pulse, feeling that beat, feeling that rhythm, seeing the musicians on stage. Is that part of what keeps that music going and keeps it relevant throughout the centuries and the years? We keep coming back to them for some reason.
We do keep coming back to it, and I think one of the amazing things about how this keeps its relevance, which, I put that term in air quotes, is because you know what has not changed a lot since Beethoven 2 was premiered? The human condition. And so I think that these are still part of us. This is still commenting on it. And a lot of music, most music does that, right? It's sort of part of that moment, right? And we see this in all kinds of music, all genres of music, and we can attach to it. But there is something about this music that evokes something in a range of emotion, and the commitment to listen to something that's more than 3.5 minutes long, right? And understand a longer form and slow ourselves down to take that in at the deepest level we can and enjoy it. And if that part is just simply sitting there and enjoying beautiful sounds, that's enough. If it's you know a lot about it and want to revel in the sonata form of this movement, that's fine too, right? But it is accessible at all of these levels in a way that I think is really special. And I think, like all great art, that's why we keep attaching to it and coming back to it, because we find ourselves in it.
Timothy, tell us about how music has enriched your life and changed your life for the better.
Yeah, I was asked this in an interview. This last fall, I was appointed as the music director of the Spoleto Festival in Charleston, South Carolina. And they were asking me in some videos they were filming about this, about my personal attachment to it. And the best way I could think of to answer it was many years ago, when I was a young conductor, and I was having an opportunity. I was doing pretty well, but I was not sure if I really wanted to fully commit an easy life. It's, you know, there are a lot of things, other paths to take, right? And so I knew that I was passionate about it, but I thought, is this the thing for me forever? And at the time, I met someone who's now a good friend, and we were talking, and she said, well, what's your favorite book? And I said, I thought about it. And I said, you know, my favorite book is a full score of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Because in that, I open that score and I read it and I find everything. Every possible emotion, every way of life and death and everything in between. I'm in awe of it. And I knew then that I was in for life.
And we are so blessed and thankful that you chose conducting and music as your path. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. We can't wait to hear the music. A round of applause for our guest conductor. Thank you, everyone.